I think we're live. Hi, I'm Aspen Baker. Welcome back. It's a new episode of How to Exhale, our series on love and hate in America. And we are filming live out of the Civic Engagement Lab, which is right in the heart of downtown Oakland. And it is a gorgeous day here today. So thank you so much for joining us. We're talking about truth in journalism, and our guest is Rebecca Ruiz, who is a journalist from Mashable. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So this is how I'm going to start this conversation, because it's really big and there's a lot of places that we could go. In my 17 years of leading Exhale, we've been featured a lot in the media. So we've been covered by bloggers, by investigative journalists, by activists that have opinions, by radio personalities, by newscasters. And we're old enough that I can sort of know the difference of what things was like before social media and after social media. So before social media, someone like you might call me, you're probably working for like a newspaper or a magazine, something in print, and say, hey, I want to do a story, and I could agree or not. They'd interview me, volunteers, whoever, and then they submit their story to the editor, and then the editor sends it to a fact checker, and then I get a call from somebody totally different. And I always pictured like a tiny little fact checker office, and they ask me a bunch of questions, and I can say, oh, that's right or that's wrong, and then the story comes out maybe a couple days or maybe several months later. And my experience was I could read that story, and depending on that journalist's take on it, I could like it or dislike it. I could agree or disagree with their take, but I couldn't dispute it because the facts were true. And then after social media, we started to have this experience where writers with a platform who may or may not have gone to graduate school in journalism started to write, and this thing where perception as fact. So they could see something and they'd be like, well, I think that's true. And then they would just write it, and nobody necessarily called or double checked any of that. And I'd say specifically, I really saw this happen for us in 2010 when we worked with MTV on their first abortion episode or special. And we had proactively reached out to all these influencers and said, will you write about us? And it was kind of like, please, it's like a favor. Are we popular enough to be written about? And overwhelmingly what was written about Exhale was positive, that people were like on our side and were sort of like for what we were for to some extent. So it was successful in terms of reach and awareness. But not everything, but some of the things that were written were wrong. And they would have been very easily fixed with a call or an email or some sort of double checking, and that just didn't happen. And so that actually made me pretty concerned in terms of our mission, in terms of like how we move this abortion conversation forward. And so now we're in this time where we have a president who promotes perception as fact, and then gets mad at the press or the media when their facts disrupt perceptions. So, So Rebecca writes on gender and sexuality and equality at Mashable. She has written for NBC News Digital and Forbes, and graduated from UC Berkeley with a master's in journalism. So thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about this huge topic.
And we're just going to take a little slice. And so let's start with you as like a fact-finding journalist in this new media landscape. Like what are the pros and cons of being a journalist at this time?
Yeah, so I actually started my career about 15 years ago at The Nation magazine, where I was an intern, and I got training in fact-checking. And that was an invaluable experience for me because it taught me how to reach out to people like you. And the importance of that. And for me, trying to confirm facts and make sure that stories are as accurate as humanly possible is important, not just for talking to folks who are, working on different, projects or initiatives, but for the audience, for people like you who want to have trust in journalists like me. And when I get something wrong, which thankfully doesn't happen that often, fingers crossed, because I try to check everything, it's disappointing to me, and I know that it disappoints people who read my stories and who are looking for trust. And the challenges of the current age that we're in, well, there are actually benefits, so let me start there.
Okay.
I think the benefits are that there are more voices than ever that we can hear and that can push back on narratives in journalism and reporting in journalism, and can actually say, wait, that's factually wrong. I know that's wrong because I lived it, right? Or just the data is wrong, right? Or can say, actually the way you frame this question maybe relies on assumptions about race or gender or sexuality that are offensive or problematic, and those voices are so important to hear because for so long they were effectively silenced. And so that is really important. Journalists can learn from that, audiences can learn from that, but the challenge is that everything is compressed now in the way that you see content in journalism. You might see an investigative story from the New York Times alongside an opinion piece of mine, alongside a blog post from a partisan outlet, right? And it all starts to blend together, especially on Facebook or on Twitter. And it's really hard to distinguish what kind of content you're reading and why. And the different types of skepticism that you might have when reading that content. And it also means that we're competing with everything that's out there on the internet. We're not just competing against different outlets, we're competing against viral videos, we're competing against pictures of your kids that your friends are liking. And so that means that often journalists and outlets that produce content that sort of spans the spectrum of hard news reporting, opinion, analysis, commentary, criticism, have to stand out from all of that, and we have to have a point of view. And I think that there are some news organizations in the States at least that can still put a hard news headline out there and you'll click on it, but I think for the most part we have to show you something that maybe you haven't seen already. So that leads to headlines that are sharper, that have more voice, but that also leads sometimes to more confusion for readers.
And so we're kind of talking as if like hard news is somehow sort of more pure, more critical, more smart, and at the same time, this history of hard news maybe having a lens that is racist or sexist, and so now we have these new voices like pushing up against that and challenging that. So how do we balance those two things, or how do we kind of go through the value of these different types of content that we're getting, news content?
Yeah, I agree. It's challenging, and even for myself as a journalist, I'm constantly kind of revisiting those distinctions and trying to understand what service they provide to an audience out there that's hungry for news. So news can come to you in all types of formats, right? And when we say hard news reporting, maybe we're talking about the Washington Post and its scoops on national security. Maybe we're talking about the latest figures from the census report. Maybe we're talking about something that just happened, a police-involved shooting where there was a fatality, where you're basically getting information that's happening in the world in real time, effectively. And that's all really important, right? We need that information to make decisions about our lives and just to understand what's happening around us. Analysis and opinion, and those two categories are increasingly blurry now online. And I write a lot of analysis. Occasionally I write opinion. So for me, the distinction is, one, analysis, I'm taking something that happened in the news and trying to synthesize it for people to understand beyond just the facts, right? Like, so you might get voices of experts who can kind of contextualize what's happened or push back on a framework that around hard news that made certain assumptions about, as we were talking about earlier, like race or gender or sexuality or religion, etc. I think a good example maybe is from a few weeks ago when there was a young man in I believe it was Maryland, who was killed by someone who's believed to be a white supremacist. So I'm not sure I'm not sure all those facts are exactly right. So I want to caveat that for you. But there was, I think, a headline or a snippet of the story where they were talking about how he wasn't a thug, something along those lines, and people really pushed back against that. like, why is that in news reporting? What assumption does that reflect, right? So analysis and opinion can serve to, again, push back against that kind of framework. And then you also have, stories that, as you were talking about earlier, people are seeing something that's been reported or been written about and synthesizing it on their own, for their own audience, without reaching out individually. And, that happens. It's very common online. And that requires another set of kind of like analytical tools on a reader's part to understand that what you're getting is kind of something that's been synthesized for you.
For example, when our my Excel co-founder, board member Susan Chorley, we had the big CNN piece a few weeks ago, and that was a journalist. I think she went to the same school as you. I mean, I'd been talking to her probably a couple of years, and then she traveled and she interviewed people in person, and that was, supported and put together this big story. And then all these other outlets, took bits and pieces of the CNN piece and sort of made up their own story, but none of those people necessarily called our office or called or talked to Susan. They're just like, oh, we can take that and run with it on our own. And so in one sense, for us, you're like, okay, well, the story's spreading, more people are reaching it, but then it kind of starts to lose, we start losing control of it as well as other people kind of take and do what they want with it. So one of the things that happens, I think, in these polarized times with a president like Trump is he does something and, he's against the media. So our reaction can be like, we're for the media.
Right.
It can become like a knee-jerk reaction of like whatever he's for or against, we're going to sort of do the opposite. So as consumers, what should we be expecting from our news or our media or our journalists? What can we be demanding or asking for so that we can have fact and critical thinking?
Yeah, I mean, that's a terrific question, and it'd probably take me much longer than a few minutes to answer it properly, but I do think, first, just an awareness that the landscape has changed, right? This isn't, 10 or 15 years ago anymore, where there was a different style and a different business model, and the reality of that has just completely changed. And so I think understanding that, and understanding that you're going to be seeing so many different types of content, and I hate to even use the word content because it's such a bland word, but I think, we could say journalism too, but content kind of encompasses a lot of what you're going to be seeing. So I think just an awareness that the old days are gone. Yeah. For better or for worse. Yeah. And we kind of have to catch up to this new reality, and as you say, make it clear what we want or expect from journalists. And I think part of that is what your own reading diet is. So being aware of, okay, when I read these three outlets, this is what I know I'm getting, and being clear about that with yourself. And I think it's okay to have filter bubbles is a whole other conversation, but an awareness of okay, I'm reading the Wall Street Journal or Vox or Breitbart or whatever it is that you're reading, then you might be getting just a different point of view, right? I think looking for signs that someone has reached out to folks to get their comment is really important. It doesn't always happen, and so when you see that, sometimes take it with a grain of salt. There's a lot of humor and sort of a voice, as you might say now, in stories that you're going to see. Take that with a grain of salt. I think the danger of lumping all of that into the same category of news and journalism is where we get into trouble in terms of our expectations.
And so should we be cynical? Should we be skeptical as we're reading things?
I can totally understand why anyone watching this might feel cynical and might feel I hate the media. I hate journalists. It makes me sad. But I get it because there have been instances where Trump has been complaining about anonymous sources and journalists making things up, and that's really alarming. Unfortunately, it has also happened in the past where we've had journalists like Jason Blair literally make up sources. And so I can understand where people are coming from and feeling cynical. What I would urge you to do is maybe try to exercise skepticism instead of cynicism. Because at the end of the day, like we need these institutions to survive, right? We need the fourth estate to survive in terms of holding people accountable and telling us what is going on in the world. And we can't do that without earning readers' trust, but also having them try to engage in journalism with skepticism instead of cynicism.
Yeah, great. I love that. Our time is up, if you can believe that. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Super enlightening, lots of insights for us to think about and chew on. I want to take a moment and acknowledge that today is the 8th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. George Tiller. Dr. Tiller was an abortion provider in Kansas, and he was assassinated in his church. And we just want to honor the work that he did and all the abortion providers that we continue to work with at Exhale today. We will be back next week with Kathy Kinnear, who is the President CEO of Planned Parenthood Affiliates of California, and we will have a lot to talk about. So thanks for joining us, and thanks again, Rebecca.
Thank you.